Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I am Deepak, your host from India. We are honored to welcome the distinguished Dr. Leonard Cassuto as our distinguished guest on Business Talk today. Before we get started, I would like to introduce the guest for today's episode. Dr. Leonard Cassuto is a professor of English at Fordham University, where he has been teaching and writing about American literature and culture since 1989. Educated at two of America's most prestigious institutions, Columbia University and Harvard University, he brings rigorous intellectual depth to everything from 19th century African American literature and disability studies to creative writing and the evolving landscape of American higher education. A prolific scholar, Professor Cassuto has authored or edited more than 10 books, including his most recent academic writing As If Readers Matter, published by Princeton University Press in 2024, a practical and witty guide for writers across all disciplines. His two landmark books on doctoral education, The Graduate School Mess, published in 2015, and The New PhD, published in 2021, cemented his reputation as a national authority on graduate education reform, leading to consulting roles with the Mellon Foundation, the Modern Language Association, and top-ranked PhD programs across the United States. Beyond academia, Dr. Cassuto is an award-winning journalist whose work spans science, sports, and culture, appearing in outlets as varied as the New York Times and Salon.com. His book, Hard-Boiled Sentimentality, The Secret History of American Crime Stories, was nominated for both the Edgar and McAvity Awards and was named one of the top 10 best books of 2008 in crime and mystery by the Los Angeles Times. A dedicated mentor, Dr. Cassuto was honored with the 2015 Northeastern Association of Graduate Schools Mentoring Award for his enduring impact on graduate students both at Fordham and nationality. He also writes the widely read column, The Graduate Advisor, for the Chronicle of Higher Education, making complex academic conversations accessible to a broad audience. In today's episode, we are truly privileged to sit down with Dr. Leonard Cassuto, and together we journey deep into the heart of his compelling book, Academic Writing As If Readers Matter, a brilliantly practical guide that challenges scholars and thinkers alike to step out of their own heads and write not just with expertise, but with the empathy, clarity, and reader firmly in mind. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Leonard Cassuto to the conversation. Professor Leonard, your gracious acceptance of our invitation means a great deal to us, and it is with an immense honor and delight that we welcome you to Business Talk.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Professor, the title of your book is almost a provocation, As If Readers Matter, implying that much academic writing is produced as if they don't. When did you first realize that the academy had a reader problem, and what finally compelled you to write about it?
Well, I'll start with the title. The title is one way to put it is it's snarky, it's sarcastic, and I was vastly amused when my brilliant editor Peter Doherty and my other brilliant editor Matt Rohal together came up with it. My working title for the book while I was writing it was How to Write Well and Why We Must, which I think is a fair enough description of a lot of what's going on in the book. But I think that the reduced title, the compressed title, the snarky, sarcastic title is an expression of my feelings about the second half of your question. You asked, when did I discover that there was a problem? In some sense, anybody who goes through the academic workplace knows that there is a problem. And I'm not just talking about professors and graduate students. People who go to college, who go to universities, who study any subject in enough depth that they will encounter the writing of experts on that subject. And now I'm talking about just about everybody. Anybody who's serious about what they're doing in the world of ideas will come across academic writing that drives them crazy. That is to say, writing that may or may not have something to say, but is more concerned with protecting the writer than it is with communicating with the reader. And I had some good writing teachers when I was growing up. Some of them came from books. That is, I was taught by good books that I read, such as The Elements of Style by E.B. White and William Strunk, or Strunk and White, as it's more often called. But and I had some good teachers who taught me in person, and so I grew up with the idea that writing ought to communicate. I was lucky. I was lucky to have received that teaching, and I was lucky to have been in the right place and the right time where I could take it in, accept it, and understand it. And so when I encountered academic writing that failed to communicate, it made me angry. It didn't make me insecure, it made me angry. It can make readers feel insecure because they often feel that they're not measuring up, that the writer is deep and smart, and oh my goodness, I don't understand it. There must be something wrong with me. I don't recall feeling that way. I recall more often thinking there's something wrong with the writing if I don't understand it, because I've got some education, I'm pretty smart. Why am I having trouble following this? And the experience of reading a lot of academic scholarship deepened that. And sadly, but not surprisingly, many people, when they're students, are assigned writing that is deficient in its communication, and they think, I should write that way. And so they perpetuate the problem instead of trying to push to solve it. I wrote this book because I wanted to push to solve it.
Professor, you argue that good academic writing is fundamentally about connection, earning the reader's time and attention. In a world of shrinking attention spans and information overload, how do academics compete for that attention without dumbing down their ideas?
So, okay, you're asking how can we communicate the depth and sophistication of whatever it is that we think without dumbing down? Okay. You also started by quoting or paraphrasing me that writing is an act of connection, academic writing included. Academic writing is too often overlooked as a source of connection. Now, I want to approach your question a little bit elliptically, because we are living right now at a time when the elephant in the room is generative artificial intelligence, AI, the large language models that are that are having such a disruptive influence on the kinds of communication that we are making with each other. Now, I'm not going to say that AI is a total poison, but I will say that something that people can do that AI can't do is that people can connect with each other. Artificial intelligence is artificial. It can't connect with anybody. It has its role. It is a tool. Perhaps we'll talk about that later. But but in any case, the human sensibility that ought to be behind any piece of writing is part of what enables the connection that you were talking about. And it's also part of what prevents or allows a writer to communicate without dumbing down. Certainly, there are many, many writers at all different levels of academia. And I'm talking about, from college students through professors. And also, as I said, anybody who's thinking and writing seriously about any subject is an academic writer. You don't have to live or work in the university to be an academic writer. You don't have to be part of the university workplace to engage in academic writing. So I want to suggest that the ambit of what I'm talking about, the ambit of my book is wider than just the academic workplace. So if the goal is to connect and not to dumb down, then the first thing that we need to remember, I believe, is something that I reproduced a picture of in the book, that we need to imagine writing and reading as a clasp of the hand, where the writer is offering a hand, the reader clasps it, and something happens between them, that there's a connection, that there's a circuit that's being made, because the writer is taking seriously the responsibility of imparting something to the reader, of teaching, of leaving the reader with something that the writer has to say. And the reader is, in turn, serious about grasping it. The greater responsibility lies with the writer. The writer has to do something that's approachable. The reader needs to be able to reach out and grasp. And if the writer is doing his or her job properly, then the writer will be thinking about what the reader's needs may be. Now, that means that any writer who is doing their job properly is going to say, who is reading this? Who am I reaching out to? What do they need from me? If I am writing for a general audience, as for example, for a newspaper or a magazine, then I need to understand that that audience may be interested in reading me, but they aren't bringing any specialized knowledge to the task. So if I want, for example, to explain a literary critical movement from the 1950s, then I need to assume that that reader may not even have any interest in literature to start with at all. So I need to provide foundational knowledge and description in order to say what I want to say about that critical movement. On the other hand, if I understand my audience to be literary specialists, for example, if I know that I'm writing for a peer-reviewed journal that is devoted to literary studies of the 20th century, then I don't need to start so low down on the foundation. I can make some fair assumptions about what my readership might be expected to know, and I can speak a little bit differently. Now, in practice, I believe that my voice sounds the same, whether I'm writing to specialists or to general audiences. But how I do it, there are some differences, and that's based on how I'm assessing the audience. In other words, part of the title of the book suggests this. Part of a writer's responsibility is to ask, who is reading this? What do they need from me? And then to try to meet those needs in order to further and create an act of communication. To write and have somebody pass their eyes over it and say, I don't get this, that's not communication. Somebody wrote something, but communication did not happen. The clasp of the hand never took place. Or perhaps it started, but then the reader couldn't hold on, pulled away. It's the responsibility of anybody doing any work of serious writing to try to create this and maintain it.
Professor, you describe jargon as the most dangerous of tools. That's a striking phrase. How do you help academic writers distinguish between jargon that builds precision and jargon that simply builds walls between the writer and the reader?
An excellent question. So how can we tell when we are using jargon for the good or for ill? Because, as I've said in the book, jargon is not automatically a terrible thing. So the proper use of jargon depends, as I think you and your audience are already gathering, on an understanding of the reader's needs. So jargon is compressed communication. It is when you're using a label to stand for an idea, or more often a cluster of ideas. So, for example, in law, there is a term called stare decisis. It's from the Latin, and it means roughly to follow judicial precedent. But there's more to it than that. When one lawyer is speaking to another, then then they can say stare decisis, and there is a complete understanding on the part of the speaker or the writer and the reader. Everyone knows what's meant by that. But if a lawyer is writing about jurisprudence for a general audience, and that lawyer starts referring to stare decisis without any explanation, then then the writer is affronting the reader. Actually, the writer is engaging in uncivil behavior because the writer is using a term that the reader may well not understand, and the writer has no reason to believe that the reader can understand it. And if the writer uses it without explanation, then the writer is insulting the reader and saying, I know something that you don't, and I'm not going to tell you what it is. And if you care enough, you're going to stop your reading and you're going to go look it up somewhere else, and then you'll come back. Well, that's a lot to ask of any reader. Most writers don't deserve that kind of extra effort. Writers need to earn it at the best. And in any case, why do that? What if a writer knows that if you know you're writing for a reader who doesn't understand your term, then explain your term. Then you can use it, because then you can engage in the advantage that jargon offers, which is efficiency. Efficiency is a great thing. If I can avoid having to explain a complex idea from start to finish each time I use it, then everyone benefits, and I can say more in a shorter period of time. But I need to know what my audience is bringing to the experience of reading me before I can engage safely and confidently in the use of jargon. Jargon is a great tool. As I said, it creates efficiency. It builds on shared understanding. But if that shared understanding does not already exist, then it has to be built. And as I said in the book too, you can invent your own jargon as long as you explain it, and then you can engage in efficiency in your own work. I invented some jargon in my own book. For example, the phrase "reading for use." I mean, you can kind of understand it if through context, but at the same time, I explained it fully to understand that the identity of a lot of academic readers who are reading in order to use the information that they're getting, as opposed to reading for pleasure. Pleasure reader is a term that's already out there. A use-driven reader, a reader who's driven by the need to use the work. I built that into my work, but I built it in a way that the reader can understand it without having to try to figure out, say, what does he mean? Well, that's a question that every writer ought to avoid. What does he mean? The reader ought to be able to understand what the writer means, and then be able to reflect on it, and thus learn and complete that circuit.
Professor, you make a compelling case for storytelling and metaphor in academic prose, tools more commonly associated with novelists than researchers. Can you walk us through a moment where you saw a scholar transform their writing simply by embracing narrative?
Certainly. So, chapter 2 of the book is called "Everything is a Story," and that's really my argument here is encapsulated in that phrase. Everything is a story, and I want to suggest that Stories are arguments, and arguments are stories. So when we write, I think that there is a tendency to forget that human beings communicate through story. That story is the oldest form of written communication. That when we look at the oldest writing we have, the epic poems such as Gilgamesh, they were transcribed. They had been passed from teller to teller through the oral tradition for many years before they were written down. And we can see in, for example, a poem like the Iliad, there are lots of phrases that we can see would have been created through repeated oral storytelling in order to pass the tale from teller to teller before it was finally written down. Writing was an important technology. It fixed a lot of these stories in time and space. But they were stories. Those were the first, the oldest writing we have are stories. Human beings are storytelling animals. And if we understand that, then we can, as writers, benefit from it and understand that the best way to explain something is through a sequence. We are such sophisticated consumers of stories that we're able to understand and apprehend them even when they're told to us out of order. And in fact, some storytellers, filmmakers exploit this, that you can begin in the present and then have a flashback. Everyone understands what's going on there. That's because we are essentially hardwired for story. So then this raises the question, why as writers do we not exploit that more than we do? And I am advocating in this book that to understand that when you write what we understand to be an essay, a disquisition, an explanation, an argument, what we're really doing is telling a story of our own encounter with an idea or a set of ideas and the understanding that we've gained from it. And we can unfold it as a sequence, and our readers can understand it using the storytelling wiring that we already have. So I'm not suggesting that academic writers should write everything as a short story or a novel, as you suggest. That's a particular kind of storytelling. Instead, I used an example in the book. There is a somewhat obscure cable television series that the comedian Jerry Seinfeld started after his colossally successful television series Seinfeld ended and left him so wealthy he would never have to make money for the rest of his life. He started doing things just that he wanted to do, and that included a television series called Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. And the series is exactly what it says it is. In each episode of the series, Seinfeld gets into a car, drives someplace, he picks up another comedian, they drive someplace else, they get a cup of coffee, and then he drives the comedian back again. And you could say, well, that's pretty boring. Well, of course, it's not intended, that's not intended to be a suspense story. The attraction of the television series, if you find it attractive, is the conversation between the comedians. And the idea is that when two clever people start talking to each other, the results are going to be interesting, witty, and clever, and somebody is going to want to listen. But so that's the point of the series. But although every episode of that series unfolds the same way, it's a story. It's a story of driving to get somebody, going to get coffee, and then coming back again. The narrative itself is not interesting, but it creates a skeleton for what's being placed on it. That is, there is a story in that television series, in every episode of that television series, and the story, the narrative frame, is something that Seinfeld, the creator of the series, is exploiting in order to get to create a vehicle for the conversation that he believes to be the most interesting part of it. Similarly, if I want to make an argument about, let's say, the evolution of Hollywood cinematography during the 20th century, and I want to argue that the cinematography became more sophisticated through the use of the new lens technology. I'm making all this up, but if I want to make such an argument, then I'll be able to make that argument more clearly if I'm able to frame it as a development that I am understanding and then communicating my understanding in a sequence of intellectual events where I'm saying, okay, this happened, but this the development of a lens that allowed for nighttime filming, this created a set of possibilities, which in turn enabled something else. Well, that's on the one hand, a historical argument, but I'm rendering it in story form. I can render it in terms of my discovery, my own of what happened. For example, that I'm making this up again, that that nighttime storytelling allowed for more suspenseful effects. So if I unfold this in a sequence, then my reader appreciates it as a story, and I can communicate it more clearly. I could be talking about coal output in Bulgaria, if indeed there is any, and I can explain it as a sequence of discoveries that I made because my encounter with this topic and my discovery of my own argument is in its own way a story. I guess what I'm saying in the end is that there is a narrative structure to the way that we think about the world. And that as writers, if we understand that not only do we have this narrative structure that forms the basis for our own understanding, but that our reader does too, that the reader is able to understand and appreciate an argument if it unfolds within a narrative structure, we can communicate in ever more sophisticated ways because as writers, we're taking advantage of skills that our reader already has, the skill of being able to understand, decipher, and appreciate a story. If on the other side, a writer fails to do that, then the reader has to untangle what the writer is doing, and that takes extra work, and perhaps the reader is going to get lost. And if the reader gets lost, we lose this.
Professor, they say you never get a second chance to make a first impression. And yet, academic introductions are often most formulaic, jargon-driven, heavy part of any paper. What does a truly great academic introduction look like, and what does it do for the reader?
So you're asking, so what does an introduction do? Well, I want to start with your observation that you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. Too many academic writers overlook that fact. This is a problem not only in academic writing, but I think right now it's a problem in the academic workplace in the United States and around the world. I've been writing about that problem in broad terms for about, well, more than 15 years. That the problem that citizens of the academic workplace are not understanding the need that we all have to connect with the larger societies that we are part of. That in a world that is functioning, I think, properly and productively, so the society at large and the academic workplace are taking care of each other. That is, it's a mutual caretaking relationship. Society, the general public says to the university, we will fund you and take care of you. And in turn, you will do things that take care of us. If that relationship breaks down, if it becomes inhabited by suspicion or worse, contempt, as is increasingly the case, not only in the United States and in other places in the world, then you don't have the basis for mutual caretaking. I say throughout the book that it's the writer's job to take care of the reader, because if readers feel taken care of, they're going to learn, and then they're going to buy more books. In the academic workplace, if we don't take care of our students, then our students and their parents and their children won't be interested in taking care of us. I've written about this in previous books. What does this have to do with introductions? I'm taking a long way through this because I want to introduce the idea, my answer to your question, in terms of the very important larger idea of caretaking. That's how I'm starting. Introductions need to introduce the idea of caretaking. An introduction needs to persuade the reader that the reader will be taken care of in the course of whatever it is that they're reading, that their needs will be noticed, that that what it is that they require in order to apprehend what the writer is saying, that the writer will be paying attention to those things. So the most important job that an introduction has is for the writer to persuade the reader that it's going to be worth it to continue. That if you read the introduction, it will persuade you that it's worth reading further, not only because it will satisfy your need as a use-driven reader, but also because if you follow through, if you give your effort, if you give your time, that you will get the reward in the form of the information that you seek. The reader is giving the writer something that is more precious than anything else in the reader's life: time and attention. Time is something you never get back once you spend it. Attention is something that you give with effort and focus. Your brain is your brain burns a lot of calories. Focusing attention is one of the most calorie-heavy activities you can engage in. It's said that somebody who's playing a game of tournament chess, and I know that in India, chess is now a very big deal because you have a tradition now of Indian chess champions, starting with Viswanathan Anand. To play a game of tournament chess, you burn about 4,000 calories. It's enormous. That's about 2 days worth. So when you think about this, so sitting down to read a book like this, may not take 4,000 calories, at least not all at once, but it takes calories. The reader is expending effort and giving time that will never get back again, that the reader will never get back again. The writer needs to communicate a sense that the writer knows that and cares about it and is going to invite the reader into a relationship that the reader can benefit from. So the job of an introduction, it's like an invitation to a party, and you're saying, if you come to this party, you're going to enjoy yourself and you're going to get something out of it. That is the bottom line.
Professor, your book draws examples from both the arts and the sciences, fields with very different writing cultures and conventions. Is the reader problem the same across disciplines, or does it take different forms in, say, a biology paper versus a literary essay?
One of the arguments of my book is that the experience of the reader is fundamentally the same. It's different in particulars, but it is fundamentally at bottom the same. That a writer is reaching out, a reader is reaching toward the writer. It's the writer's job to make the connection. Now, there are many differences in convention. Here's one, that in most disciplines, most of the time, active voice is preferable to passive voice. That for me to say, I threw the ball, is better than saying the ball was thrown by me. The active voice is more direct. It typically uses fewer words. It's easier to follow. And it's also more responsible because it centers the agent, the person who's throwing the ball in the example that I just gave. For all of those reasons, active voice is generally a form that writers should prefer. And this is something that, I didn't invent this idea. You can find it in many writing handbooks. However, in the laboratory sciences, the action that's being performed, for example, a chemistry experiment, is more important than the person who is performing it. If I'm writing a lab report, an account, let's say, for example, of the molecular workings of color dyes. Again, I'm making something up. If I'm and I'm experimenting by adding by trying to dye cloth in the presence of certain chemical agents, then what I'm doing is more important than the fact that I'm the one who's doing it, because the whole idea of writing a lab report is saying, you can do this too, and you will get the same result that I got. Reproducibility is a very important issue in experimental science. And there are some scientists who devote their careers to trying to reproduce famous results to make sure, in effect, to check their accuracy. So if I'm writing a lab report, I'm explaining that I did a set of things, but I'm arguing that you can do them too. That it's not important that I did them. It's important that somebody did them, and that anybody who follows the instructions can do them and achieve the same results. Therefore, in science writing, in reports of experiments, passive voice often proliferates. There's a lot of passive voice because the action is more important than the actor. A titrate was added to the solution was titrated, because that's what's important here. The fact that I did it, less important. I don't need to lead with the fact that I titrated the solution in the following ways, because really what's important is not that I did it, because you could do it too. What's important is that it was done. And so in this particular case, passive voice is not only okay, but in some ways it's better, because it's centering what's important in the writing, which is the action, the experimental action that's being taken. So this is a particular case where the conventions of science writing are different from that of most other disciplines, where active voice takes responsibility and communicates more crisply and more clearly. But at the bottom of both science writing and the other forms is the need for the writer to communicate, to connect with the reader, to explain what needs to be explained, to prioritize what needs to be prioritized. And in that respect, science writers are the same as anyone else. And that's why I included many examples from science to show that science writers are typically engaged in trying to reach the same objectives as writers from humanistic disciplines or social scientific disciplines. There are ways that we are all the same, and those ways I think are very important for us to keep in mind in order for us as a group of thinking people to communicate with each other.
Professor, you go deep into the mechanics, transitions, signposts, paragraphs, and sentences. For an academic writer who has spent years developing their voice, is there one single structural fix that almost always makes writing more readable?
The short answer to the question, is there one big fix? Yes, it's the title of this book. It's to write with the reader in mind. That's the big fix, because the writing is, and I've said this to many students, and I say it several times in the book as well, because it's an important idea. Important ideas need to be repeated. That's signposting. So signposting is a good idea because it calls the reader's attention to the ideas that are most important. One of the most important ideas that I signpost in this book, I say it and I repeat it and I call attention to it, is that writing involves a series of judgment calls. That is, writers need to make judgments because it's not always obvious what it is to do. If I'm writing for a particular magazine, I make inferences about who's reading it. But if I'm going to ask, well, if I'm writing for the Chronicle of Higher Education, how much should I assume that my reader knows about the history of colleges in the United States? Does the reader know that in the United States, colleges proliferated for over 200 years before the first university was founded? I have to make a judgment about that. And if I decide, no, my reader probably doesn't know everything about that, then I need to explain more carefully. If I decide, oh, that's common knowledge, then I can proceed as though my reader already knows it. In the example that I just gave, I think that it's not common knowledge. But we can imagine examples that might provide more sort of scratching of the head and saying, maybe yes, maybe no. In those situations, writers and anyone else who's trying to navigate the world in a complex world have to make judgments. We have to make judgments as we go along. And it goes without saying, perhaps, that as we gain more experience making judgments, we get better at it because we see, oh, this one worked out, this one didn't. Now I know what to do in a similar situation. Experience builds judgment. That's one of the reasons that the more you write, the better at it you get, because you get more practice making judgments. So writing then entails a series of judgment calls, and we need to be able to do the best job that we can making those judgments. Well, how can we do that? And the answer is by putting yourself into the reader's place as well as you can. Say, how can I take care of the reader? If I'm making this judgment call, how can I make that judgment with the reader's needs in mind? That's the one big fix. The more you think about the situation of the reader, the more likely you are to make the kinds of judgments that will enable the reader to stay with you, to connect with you, to benefit from your work. That's the one thing. Write with the reader in mind. And if you say, okay, that seems so obvious, then a question that might arise from that is that if this is so obvious, why is there so much bad academic writing out there? Why is there so much bad writing of different kinds? It's because it's not obvious how to do this. It requires practice, it requires experience, and it requires reading my book.
Professor, more than ever, academics are being asked to write for public audiences, policy brief, op-ed, blogs, even social media. Does the advice in your book bridge the gap between writing for a specialized journal and writing for a curious, intelligent, non-specialist?
So I said earlier in our podcast that I see a consistency in my own voice, whether I'm writing for general audiences or specialized audiences. I think that as writers gain experience, they will have the same. They'll make the same discovery that I did. That no matter who you're writing to, if you're writing thoughtfully, you're writing as yourself. Now, you are, of course, entirely correct that members of the academic community are increasingly called upon to speak to more diverse, more general audiences. I want to pull back from that for a moment. I think that that's a positive development in the main, but there's a reason for it. I think the reason for it is because there is an increasing sense that that the academic workplace has become too drastically separated from the society at large that supports it, that it is, as I said earlier, engaged in a mutual caretaking relationship with. In order to maintain and allow that caretaking relationship to prosper, we need to be able to engage in understanding, in communication with understanding with not just specialized audiences within the academic workplace, but more general ones outside it. This is part of the overall health, not only of the academic workplace, but of civic society. In civil or civic society, we need to be able to talk to each other. We need to be able to disagree without being disagreeable. We need to be able to exchange ideas. The academic workplace ought to be a model for that. If academics are writing in ways that they can't understand each other, then we're not a model for it. The movement towards communicating with diverse audiences is a return to the mandate that all writers ought to have, and academic writers have a special responsibility for, to connect with the people you're taking care of so that they can take care of you. The book that I wrote is trying to distill some general principles that allow for that kind of diverse communication, to understand that what a writer is doing each time that writer sits down to write that writer is identifying and communicating with an audience. If the writer is careless about understanding that identification or figuring out the needs of that audience, then the communication won't happen. This is one of the reasons why AI-generated writing has so many limitations that are attached to it, because it's not a human sensibility, and and to the extent that it's prompted, it can only approximate what's going on because it's predictive. It's not creative. And so we, the creative sensibility on the other side of it, have to take responsibility for what it is that we can bring to this. As I said, a human sensibility that seeks to connect with other humans.
Professor, you are yourself a prolific academic writer, a columnist for the Chronicle of Higher Education, and an award-nominated author of crime writing. How has writing across such different genres shapes your understanding of what makes any piece of writing, academic or otherwise, truly work?
I think that in my time when I first started as a professional as a professor, as an academician. When I first entered the academic workplace in the late 1980s, I spent a number of years writing principally for specialized audiences because I had to do this in order to establish my credibility as a writer in order to secure my job. So after I was able to do that, then I think I understood more clearly that my own mission as a professional intellectual was to try to collapse the distinction that you're describing, to try to write in ways that could benefit specialists and general readers at the same time. And so the monograph that I wrote on detective stories, that you referenced a moment ago, crime fiction, I think I was deeply gratified and honored that it was nominated for an Edgar Award, which is like the Oscars in that field. But it wouldn't have received that recognition if the jury had not been able to read it with understanding and pleasure, because prize juries don't have any patience for work that doesn't communicate with them. So that recognition, among others, was not only gratifying to me, but also validating. It was validating my effort to write in a way that could benefit specialists and generalists at the same time. Anybody who reads a detective story or a crime story or watches a film noir for a reason other than pure diversion, that is, if you're reading it, if you're trying to think about what crime stories mean, what they do for us, you don't have to be a professor to ask that question. Why are crime stories so popular? Why do we consume them in this way that we do? That's a question that's not just a professor's question. That's a question that any two curious people could engage in over lunch, over dinner, over a drink. And I wrote that book, and everything that I've written ever since is an effort to try to communicate with those two people who are having a serious conversation about a topic, or a professor who's trying to use my analysis to try to further their own analysis. I think that they can be and should, at least in my field, they can be the same thing. And I want to say too, I talked about a serious conversation. I want to say to your readers that this book is also funny. I wrote it to be not only serious, but I wanted it to be amusing too. There are, I hope, moments where a reader might chuckle, might even laugh, and might poke the person that's next to them with an elbow and say, "Hey, listen to this." That to me is a measure of a certain kind of success as a writer that I want. That I want not only to communicate, to instruct, I want to give pleasure. But at the bottom of the pursuit, we do need to communicate, first of all.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. If a graduate student or a senior scholar picks up your book and reads just one chapter before their next writing deadline, which chapter would you want it to be, and what is the single most transformative idea you hope they carry back to their desk?
Oh my, so which excerpt would be the most important? I think that certainly I would want, as an introduction, I'd want someone to read chapter 1 as in the spirit of the introduction that I talked about, say, oh, that's really good. I want to read the whole thing. But there's another takeaway here. And in the spirit of conclusion rather than introduction, the concluding chapter of this book is called Why We Must. You may remember, I'm trying to bring things full circle here. The working title of this book while I was writing it, excuse me, was How to Write Well and Why We Must. And the how to write well is very important. Most of the book is devoted to instruction in how to write well, which I hope is delivered in good humor and good spirit. But why we must is an idea that I want to conclude with here. I've alluded to this earlier in our podcast, that there is a responsibility, there's an obligation, that there's a mutual caretaking relationship between academia and the larger society, that we're taking care of each other. We need to be able to trust each other in order for that care to pass back and forth. Just as communication involves a clasp and a circuit, care requires the same thing. If I'm going to accept your care, I need to trust you. If you're going to accept my care, you need to trust me. That the caretaking relationship in the United States and around the world right now between the university and the society it serves is breaking down. It has been eroded over time. We need to build that relationship back up. Academics have a responsibility for our part of this. The university is our space. We need to make that space into a responsible and caretaking place, starting with our writing and our teaching. Now, the teaching is a subject that I've written about in other books, including, for example, this one. But this book is about the writing part. Writers have a responsibility. That responsibility, as I said, is to communicate. But we need to communicate in order to take care of our reader and to make the world better. That when this happens, when this circuit happens, the world gets larger. Something passes from one person to another. The world gets larger, knowledge spreads. If this fails to take place, if as in so much academic writing, the writer writes, but the reader doesn't grasp, then the world fails to get larger. And if the reader is aggravated or even angry at the performance by the writer, then the world can even get smaller because that reader is going to withdraw from that relationship. I would like for a reader of my book not only to want to write well, but to understand why academic writers have a collective responsibility, a civic responsibility to write well in order to add to the common store and create a responsible caretaking relationship that can allow us as a population to face the challenges that are before us and to come out of it better than we started. That I think that one of the great privileges that I have in my job is that I can get up in the morning and I can look in the mirror and I can say, today I'm going to try to leave it better than I found it. Any writer who is engaged in a serious task of communication can leave it better than they found it. And that's what I hope that writers and readers together can engage in as we move together forward.
Listeners, As we close today's conversation, I am reminded of a simple but powerful truth Dr. Cassuto has shared with us. Writing is not just about what you know, it's about how generously you share it. Thank you, Dr. Cassuto, for your time, your wisdom, and your wonderful book. It has been truly a privilege. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I love that concluding line. Yes, it is. It's how you share it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.